you spoke about post-secular or secular religions would be there, and then you spoke your last talk about almost like a land of revelation. Right? Would that be fair?
In the city of disenchantment, I think the city of disenchantment is just being, as I tried to point out, just being tired with the gods, just trying to focus on what we can see and touch and taste and smell, and getting on with the project of building a society that's workable for us, without reference to all the mumbo jumbo from the land of enchantment.
This could be a question for either of you. It's kind of a question about our big theme of the weekend, but is it fair to say that no one would know in their lifetime whether their religion or faith is correct and has the answer? Isn't it enough to live our lives believing that we are correct and accepting that others believe the same about their own faiths? It's a question of religious pluralism again. Why isn't, nobody's going to really know, right?
Well, it depends what we mean by know, of course. If we're talking about know something with 100, that we know 100% that it's true. No. You know, does anyone in this room know with 100% certainty that we're all actually sitting here rather than being brains in a vat somewhere being stimulated by a mad scientist to have the external perceptions that we're having, or that we're involved in some sort of a matrix? You know, there's just no way that you can know that with 100% certainty. Or how do we know that we all weren't just created 5 minutes ago with memories of things that never happened and food in our stomachs, well, no longer, but food in our stomachs of meals we never ate? Well, we can't know that for certain. What we can do is look for reasonable certainty. And I'll be honest with you, this is something that I've struggled with, very honestly. I tend to have doubts at times, and I used to struggle with them a whole lot more. But I will probably struggle with doubts occasionally for the rest of my life. It's just the way I'm wired. Because this whole thing about worldview and does God exist, and if so, who is he, she, or it, I think is the most important question we can ask, especially if our eternal destiny hinges on getting this right. So the way I began to put it over the last year is, you know, let's suppose you've got a plank that's maybe 6 feet wide and extends across the stage, and you say, Mike, you got to stay on this plank. You know, I could walk that way, I could walk backwards on it, I could run on it, I could almost run backwards, I could probably do a few cartwheels on it and stay within that 6 foot wide thing, and you know, and never have any problems. But take that plank and extend it between 2 skyscrapers, and I'm going to worry. And it's not because I couldn't do it, it's because, well, what if? And we're talking about, you know, potential consequences that are just unthinkable. And that's what sometimes keeps me awake at night. You know, what if I'm wrong? Yeah, I've looked at this evidence, I've really wrestled with it, and I've wrestled with it as honestly as I know I can. But what if I'm wrong? So I don't think we can know with 100% certainty, but I do think that when we look at the evidence, and there's extraordinary evidence to suggest that Christianity is true, I think we can have adequate certainty. And so if we come in with reasonable expectations, this shouldn't really worry us too much.
Sure. Steve, what does it mean, I guess, how would you define what it means to be spiritual or religious, and should Christians be either, or should they be both? What should Christians be on a...
I think if we understand the terms, I think we can use them. Religious in its most basic meaning is just simply to try to connect things, religare. I mean, it's trying to understand how things are connected. So if you want to be religious, then in that most basic sense, you're just trying to understand how things are connected. Spirituality today is spoken of in opposition to religion, and so that as we've heard, somebody can be an atheist and yet be spiritual. I'm intrigued as to what what does spirit mean in an atheistic conception. I know that Bart Campolo is now a humanist chaplain, I think, in Southern California somewhere. And I don't know if you know his story, but he had quite a ministry, as far as I know, in Christian work, and then became a humanist. I don't know if he calls himself an atheist, but he certainly promotes some kind of spirituality that he sees himself as a chaplain of. And spirituality is just too vague. It just means what kind of spirituality are you referring to? It's meant to be a kind of as though we all understand what it means. But once you start qualifying it, okay, are we talking about Hindu spirituality, Islamic Sufism? What are we referring to? Yeah.
Dr. Licona, there's a couple of questions that push back on the point you made about Jewish people borrowing from pagan religions. First, doesn't the Bible record again and again Jewish people turning to other gods? You said that they wouldn't have turned to the pagan myths, but isn't the Old Testament they turn to the pagan gods again and again and again? How do you explain that?
Well, sure, no question about that. I don't mean all Jews. I was talking about pious Jews. I think I mentioned pious Jews. So, these were the same Jews that were going to Pilate saying, get that image out of our city. We'd rather die and see it. Well, those aren't the same ones that are turning to other gods. The Jewish Christians who were debating over the minutiae of the Jewish law, could they eat meat sacrificed to idols? Could Jewish Christians even eat in the same room as Gentile Christians? Did Gentile male Christians needed to be circumcised? These aren't the same kind of Jews that had the tendency to just run to other gods. They were there and saying, if we remain faithful to God and obey Him, Yahweh, can we do these things as Christians? So I don't see a problem.
So the pious Jews would have been the ones who revered and respected the Scriptures.
Exactly.
But Genesis 1. I'm sure as a scholar, you've studied the correlations between Genesis 1 and some of the Babylonian myths. And so we had another question. Isn't the creation account an example of Jewish people borrowing from pagan myths, pious Jewish people?
Yeah. I can't answer that. That's a question for Old Testament scholars, and of which I am not. So I have enough trouble understanding the culture of which the New Testament was written, and that's a lot. So, I mean, personally, I don't believe that Genesis 1 borrows from pagan myths, but I'm not prepared to defend that. It's just not my area of expertise.
Jason, can I ask another follow-up question that was on it? It's not the next one on the slide, but I'm going to push you again.
Sure.
Because somebody is familiar with your work in Greco-Roman biography.
Okay.
That you've done a lot to show correlation, or of course, like not borrowing, but comparing the gospel writings to Greco-Roman biography.
Sure.
Somebody understood that and is familiar with your work, and they said, why do you think it's legitimate to do that sort of looking for parallels with biology, but not with mythology?
Well, I'd say you can look for parallels, and you can find them. Like I mentioned, and they're easy to find because human history is so immense with stories of events that have happened and myths that have been made up. You're always going to be able to, it's easy. Just take 5 minutes. You can come up with some parallels for anything. You've got to show that there's a causal connection, though, that the Christians borrowed, and you can't do that. Now, when it comes to showing that the Gospels share much in common with Greco-Roman biography, that's just talking about genre. So, for some reason, unknown to us today, Jews were not writing biographies of their sages during the time of Jesus. So Greco-Roman biography was the only game in town for them if the gospel authors are going to write biographies of Jesus. And we see that the gospels share much in common with that. Now, just because they're Greco-Roman in the genre doesn't mean they're pagan, anything like that. It just means that that was a certain genre. It's still biographical.
By genre, you mean like a form of writing?
Yeah. Same thing with Luke. He's writing Greco-Roman history. Well, people like Craig Keener, Colin Hammer, and others have shown how the book of Acts is very sound as an accurate historical writing. So just because it follows the Greco-Roman genre of history doesn't mean it's pagan, per se, or has all these myths in it. Now, Greco-Roman biography was a little more flexible in how things could be reported. In my studies in Greco-Roman biography, you look at Plutarch, and he's the most, not a Plutarch of the Hunger Games, but the real Plutarch who lived in the 1st century, and he's one of the most prolific writers of that time. Much of what we know about the ancient world comes from him. And it's real interesting because, he'll report many stories in two or more of his biographies, because they're the same people who are engaging in, like Julius Caesar, that his assassination is reported in several, I think 4 different of the biographies he wrote, the biography of Caesar, Cicero, Antony, and Brutus. So you're going to find the same story repeated 4 times. And so by comparing how he tells the same story, you can see the kind of compositional devices that he used that would often result in the same kind of differences that we find in the Gospels, which is suggestive that the Gospel authors were using the same kind of compositional devices.
They use the same sort of form, but that doesn't mean they were borrowing content.
Right.
Okay.
And it's like the book of Revelation. It's apocalyptic literature. And the Jews wrote apocalyptic literature. You look at 1st Enoch, 4th Ezra. It reads a whole lot like Revelation. So I'm not saying Revelation isn't true. I'm just saying you have to understand the kind of genre. Psalms is songs. All right, so when it says, the psalmist says to God, awake you who sleep, we don't have to imagine that God is actually sleeping, because we understand the genre of the Psalms. And it's the same thing with biography and history and all those.
You spoke of inevitable parallels. There's inevitable parallels. You spoke of that. Couldn't one understand Jesus' supposed fulfillment of prophecy as inevitable parallel?
Fulfillment of prophecy as an inevitable. Can you explain what you mean by that?
I just read the questions.
Oh, okay. So
I think what they're saying is, so there's prophecies about a Messiah. Other world religions have prophecies about future coming things. Somebody inevitably might have come along and fulfilled them, and it's not.
Some of them could be
actually divine fulfillment. It's possibly coincidence, or it would be inevitable that somebody would meet the.
Sure. I mean, you got fortune tellers. They're able to do some things like that because things are, but some, I guess you could say some, but some not. Now you could I could see how the earliest Christians could look at Psalm 22, how about they've pierced my hands and my bones are out of joint and all this, and look at that as a crucifixion, because it really looks like it's talking about a crucified victim. There are some prophecies that are really, really, I'm not a student of prophecy. It's not that it's bad or anything. I only have so much time, and it's just not been one of my things. But from what I've seen and heard in lectures, there are some prophecies that are really, really, really impressive. And then there are some prophecies that aren't really that impressive. So, I'll look at how Paul and some of the early Christians, like in Acts, they interpret Psalm 16:10. You will not allow your Holy One to see decay. And Paul says, this was originally written of David, but it's not referring to David because David died, was buried, and his body decayed. We know where he's buried. But Jesus died, was buried. His body did not decay, but God raised him, and of that we're eyewitnesses. That's in Acts chapter 2, 10, and 13. But if you read Psalm 16:10, its original context, it's David, and he's basically saying, I'm praying for God to rescue me, and he will not allow me to die and see the grave. Well, Paul takes that as referring to Jesus and reinterprets it for that reason but he uses it in a different context. We would call that charismatic exegesis. Not putting down the charismatics, but charismatic exegesis in that sense. Same thing with Psalm 2:7. It's a coronation hymn where it says, you are my son, today I've begotten you. And that's like God is saying, hey, now that you're a king, I have embraced you as my son. Where the early Christians took that and applied that to Jesus' resurrection. Because you are my son, I have begotten you. I've given you life by raising you from the dead. And they apply that to the resurrection. So I wouldn't look at those as, say, impressive prophecies. But what I would do is look at that and say, wow, the Christians, they saw the risen Jesus, and now they're going back to scriptures and they're trying to make sense of this from scripture, and this is what they found. I almost have to stretch it a little bit. That actually works in favor of history. Although it takes away from prophecy, it makes an argument for the historical resurrection of Jesus more weighty. So, yeah, that's just a little thought on prophecy.
Thanks.